All right, so let's talk about interesting things that we learned today. Lots of you picked radically different data sets. And when you picked different data sets, we found that the performance of naive Bayes versus KNN actually varied quite a lot. Like, we weren't able to get to a point of saying in some absolute sense, naive Bayes always good, KNN always bad, right? It really varied a lot depending on what was going on. One lesson then that is just crucially important from this assignment is there is no best machine learning algorithm. There just isn't. There can certainly be algorithms that tend to do well in a lot of situations and so forth, and that's all good. But there's not really going to be a best algorithm. Sort of the second point is our guesses are often wrong, right? We might have an idea about this ought to work well, this won't work well, or whatever, but those are just guesses, and there's really no substitute for conducting the underlying experiment. Furthermore, there's the whole issue of variation. And when we do variations, like say lower only versus mixed case, it again comes down to experiment, right? In some instances, the case really isn't saying anything significant and in fact can be an information destroyer. In other circumstances, the case of the letters actually conveys information. And so it can be a real challenge to figure out for building a classifier what kind of information you're discarding before you even begin the learning process. It can make a difference. So thinking about these general points, I was wondering if we might be able to think about KNN and naive Bayes, and for each of these, based on what you saw your classmates reporting, what kinds of situations seemed to be good for KNN and what kinds of situations seemed to be good for naive Bayes? What thoughts do you all have, having now seen a lot of examples? Yeah, Innocent.
I would say data that has sentences in which the sense from corresponding categories are sort of different in structure that help KNN do better. And for example, in the case of ham versus spam and ham, messages are so different in terms of how they're written that KNN can source for them very easily.
Right. The vocabularies, like the set of vocabulary you use for the one is a really different set of vocabulary than the other. Yeah. Good. Other thoughts? Put it together. What's some things that favor naive versus KNN? Yeah, Mitchell.
Maybe naive works better if you have more training. I guess they would both work better, but I feel like naive would work even more better instead of increasing training.
So it seems to scale better. And why do you think that's the case?
Well, it's definitely faster, uses less memory, but I think that because it's based off of probabilities rather than calculations, each one has better chance of it.
So why don't we dive into that a little bit? Mitchell is saying because naive Bayes is doing these probabilities, it seems to give it a better chance of getting things right. So why don't we ponder the sentiment analysis problem that you all had to do? I think it was pretty universal that naive Bayes did better on that than KNN. I think, yeah, I don't think anybody had the opposite situation. Correct me if I'm wrong. Okay. So let's think about some of the factors that could have affected this. With KNN, there's a sense in which every word matters. Every word is significant because every word is kind of equally responsible for contributing to this distance metric. And even if you use stop words, or you've got a noise word list or whatever, many words can effectively be noise in context. You know, some words just don't matter. With naive Bayes, words that are kind of evenly represented in both wind up having no effect, right? So if the presence of a given word is not so much associated or equally associated with both categories, then the effect on those probabilities is going to be neutral. It's as if both of the big multiplications got multiplied by a constant for every word that doesn't matter. The bigger the ratio is between how often a word appears in one category and the other category, the more powerful and influential a multiplier that probability turns out to be. So naive Bayes really seemed to shine in what we were looking at when you could say, you know, that individual words, you know, control the outcome. Whereas maybe we could say with KNN and thinking about the spam versus ham, there's a sense in which this is a case where clustered words control the outcome. And so here I want to think about Eric's data set and his experiments, which were a real success story for KNN. It's pretty easy to imagine a particular type of publication having a certain vocabulary pattern that tends to be dominant. So the way that a New York Times article is written is going to have a fairly significant cluster of heavily frequently used words. And that can even be emergent from the style guide associated with the newspaper. A really notorious example of this would be the British magazine, The Economist. I don't know how many of you are familiar with The Economist. But what's really interesting about The Economist in this context is most of its articles have anonymous authors. That is, they're intended to reflect the bias, as it were, or the perspective might be a better term, of the publication as a whole as it filters things through its own distinctive philosophy. Concretely speaking, The Economist was founded in the mid-19th century to object against what were called the Corn Laws, which were a set of trade barriers against the importation of agricultural products. And so The Economist then has the self-perspective as being a free trade advocating political publication. And that ethos has existed for nearly 200 years. So authors are expected to kind of anonymize themselves and advocate for the particular view, the particular editorial line of the paper as a whole. To that end, I've actually seen their style guide. They published it at some point. And the restrictiveness of it was nothing short of astonishing. Like the way that they specified the precise style of English you ought to use and all kinds of stuff. If you imagine then that many different publications or types of publications then have similar guidelines, the overall word counts are going to cluster in highly idiosyncratic ways that when you compare the bags of words are going to lead to lower distances. New York Times versus abstracts for a medical journal. I mean, BAMO, those are fundamentally different kinds of things. And that really gave KNN a chance to shine. With spam versus ham, you have kind of the same phenomenon. Every spam is carefully designed to try to sell you something. And so there's a particular type of vocabulary where lots of words are going to co-occur. In a way, what we're looking at is situations where the naivety of naive Bayes works somewhat counter to the goal, right? It's not just a collection of, well, you know, this word is here, so maybe this, maybe that. It's actually saying, here is a whole collection of co-occurring words that are fundamentally not independent in a deep fundamental sense that help characterize that it's this kind of thing versus that kind of thing. We're speaking strictly in relative terms. Naive Bayes works pretty well with spam filtering. But thinking about how the independence assumption is crippling it a bit can give us some insight as to where KNN can really shine. So any other aspects of these that might explain some of the differences that struck anyone or occurred to anyone? Yes, Dan.
It strikes me that naive Bayes is not as influenced by data sets that are different in size. I mean, we normalize
Right.
KNN, but it's still an additive process. And if you have 1,000 words versus 10 words, even at the additive process, it's going to skew the distances, whereas KNN, you're multiplying by 1. And those extra 920 words or however many times 1 makes no difference.
Right. So naive Bayes tends to be a bit more invariant to certain aspects of the underlying document structure. So again, this is a way of thinking about their pros and cons. If the document structure, like we mentioned up here, is really stereotyped and a nice way to separate things, KNN does a good job of discovering that. If the document structure really doesn't help you, naive Bayes winds up being a better choice. So, you know, we're going to be doing quite a bit of machine learning work over the next several weeks. Needless to say, with all the work we're going to do, we're still only introducing machine learning in here. We're not giving you what you might call high-level expertise. But what I'm really hoping to do is get you to learn some of these really basic concepts of how do you even think about what a machine learning algorithm is doing? How do you identify strengths and weaknesses? And importantly, for any given problem, try more than one. Because often the intrinsic bias in the structure of the algorithm isn't altogether clear until we've actually run some experiments and seen this is where it's performing well, this is where it's performing badly. From there, we often have to think about what about the underlying data structure at the heart of the algorithm moves it in a more positive or a more negative direction. We might even get to a point where we're ready to conduct some experiments to think about that and to try to get at what's at the heart of its ability to separate or not separate things. Much of the appeal of these kinds of algorithms comes down to the idea of, well, I just gave you a bunch of labeled stuff, go figure it out. But at the same time, there's an awful lot of context we're ignoring outright. Like, neither of these approaches do anything with grammar, you know? And that can have a huge, huge influence, especially in a language like English. So there's also the aspect that it's so hard to get all of the context in the human mind into play here. It's just really, really difficult. Yeah, David.
Do you weight the probabilities based off of if the word is at the beginning of the sentence or at the end of the sentence?
Oh, sure you could.
And that would that increase what you were just talking about?
Maybe it would. Maybe it wouldn't, right? You know, one thing that happens a lot is we get ideas And you might pose a question like David did, would that help it? And the best we can say is, I have a reason to believe this might help. It might be interesting to see. And then we just have to run an experiment. It's not always possible to come up with sort of concise a priori answers about this stuff. Yeah,
So you mentioned that there is no such thing as the best machine learning algorithm.
that's right.
So let's say in the systems that you see that uses machine learning in themselves,
Mhm.
do like their creators, do they try to probably have like multiple implementation in place that kind of run on any particular instances and then try all of those different algorithms and then pick the best?
Oh, yeah.
Or they kind of study the environment, they're like, Kennen is the best in this environment, we're going to use Kennen. What is the typical approach they use?
Both happen. Both are common, right? So yeah, if there's a particular kind of data that is the mainstay of what you're examining and you find this thing tends to work well, yeah, you'll just reach to the shelf and use it. I think in general, you should always use at least two, just to make sure that you're not over-specializing, so to speak. But yeah, it's common to just try several and see which works the best. Sometimes people will even do seemingly goofy things like train 20 classifiers and let them vote. Yeah, that's called an ensemble. Yeah, so people will do that. Yeah. Well, seemingly silly. Like in practice, it can be a really good idea. The part that seems silly about it is the whole, oh, I give up. Boom. Let's throw 20 things at it. What can be problematic there is that in the ensemble, you want to have some reason to believe that the different constituent elements are actually different from each other, that are giving beneficial diversity to what kinds of classifications happen, you know. And that actually, again, requires some careful thought. So the ensemble idea can be a lot of fun. And in fact, late in the semester, we're going to look at one version of it, which is called the random forest. Random forests are actually really, really popular these days. They do well on a broad range of problems. Wonder, why is it called a random forest? Well, it's a forest of trees, decision trees, which is an approach we'll be looking at later. And then they got randomized somehow. So that's an example of trying to make the ensemble representative of a significant portion of the solution space. If you can take a given kind of machine learning data structure and you've got ways of creating different classifiers by some kind of random variation among them, that can give you like a nice statistical sample of the overall space of good solutions. So, and we'll talk about this when we get there. With decision trees, the forest idea is really appealing because decision trees can easily get overtrained, over-specialized on a particular kind of thing. So on Thursday, we're going to examine one of the most popular in multiple senses machine learning algorithms, which is the artificial neural network, and the specific form of it, which is called the multi-layer perceptron. So we're going to go over that in a lot of detail on Thursday, and we're going to be applying it to the problem of shape recognition. And we'll do some neat stuff with that. So see you on Thursday.